everyone. Well, welcome back. You can see I have a lot of books back here. A lot of criminal justice books, book about crime, books about violence. A lot of these books, though, have a sociological angle. Criminology came from sociology, and so it makes sense that we would still focus on that. This week, week 5, we're going to start to take that route. We're going to go away from the individualistic approach we were taking, and we're going to look into societies and communities and neighborhoods and how that organization and disorganization within those environments is going to be conducive to crime. We're also going to look at upbringing, social interactions within households, the ways in which people live, the code by which they're brought up, at times code of the street, and how that influences whether or not they are going to commit crimes. So let's get started. I'm gonna go to my chair. Can you move? Sorry about that, everyone. Hard to find good work these days. The coffee made it over here. So let's get started. Week 5. We are now getting away from the individual element that we've been focusing on prior, whether it's individual rational choice, whether it's individual decision making based on costs and benefits, whether it's the individual situation that we're talking about that lends itself to crime, or whether we're talking about biological elements and positivism. We're now starting to focus on the social concept of crime, the social structural tradition. A lot of the theories we're going to talk about in the next few weeks, a lot of the theories from the 20th century, we really started to focus on this crime as being a social byproduct phenomenon, and this ideology that behavior is a social product, individuals are social beings, so crime is a social product. We look at a few this week, we're going to look at a few more next week, and then a little bit the following week, I believe. But the social structure is the framework of these social institutions. We'll talk about family today, educational, religious, economic, political institutions. Some of those, all of those work together. And inequalities of political institutions, economic, those can put us in situations that we'll discuss today with disorganized communities and neighborhoods and inequities, and later on we'll talk about the kind of societal inequalities that have to do with economics and political institutions and whatnot when we talk about critical criminology. But next week also we'll talk about economic issues when we talk about strain theory. So the idea is that these all work together in a symbiotic relationship, and that really neighborhoods and organizations are, which we'll get into a little bit with social disorganization, but the idea that they're kind of living things a little bit. So we assume that human nature is socially constructed, different from kind of this nature versus nurture conversation we had before. We don't look at individuals having a specific nature to them that is going to predispose them to crime. And we don't necessarily deal on the nurturing that has individually, we deal with it somewhat with subcultural theories that we'll talk about today, but we don't look at specifically how an individual was nurtured to be to the point where they are making the decision to commit crime. We still look at crime now as a socially constructed event, and any behavior that individuals have is a result of socially constructed ideas and values and beliefs that in terms of the subcultural theories that a large group of people share that have to do with violence usually and other things like that. So these parts work together, and they interact together to form to potentially form a positive situation, but sometimes form a situation where you have neighborhoods and areas and communities that are kind of disorganized and prone to criminal activity taking place, or you have some groups, subcultures, groups of individuals that are kind of likely to commit crime based on shared norms they have that are different and deviant from societal norms. Couple key points to focus on. We're going to look at two different theory groups, so to speak, today, but there are some commonalities there. That should say subcultural theories, not subculture theories, but really the same idea of a subculture of individuals that have a certain shared group of shared values that can consist of crime and consist of violence to deal with life situations. Again, we're no longer looking at this through the individual means. We're looking at this through social, as a social construct. Social meaning kind of the micro social grouping level, where we look at, compared to macro societal, but we look at neighborhoods, other communities, areas of the city itself, and then the social element of social interaction with your family, upbringing, with other people that you spend time with, peers, other family members your age, things like that. So environment we focus on with the specific environment of buildings, neighborhoods, but also the environment of the family in which you're brought up in, that environment. And again, like I said, environment meaning other people that you spend time with a lot. Formative years are going to be more important than anything else, especially with subcultural theories, to a certain degree social disorganization, but developing these shared beliefs and values in this subculture is usually not something that's going to happen later on in life. It's going to happen in teen years or earlier, and that influence will be felt especially when young children are impressionable, and then also in their teen years when people are still impressionable and they're introduced to other things like other social settings like high school and whatnot. So that those collective formative years are going to be very important in developing these values and beliefs of the subculture. So the subculture, again, where there are these shared beliefs, but we are not focusing on people in this group of people still having their individual choice in the matter. Again, everybody decides to commit crime, but more importantly, the culture has this shared mindset, sort of, this consensus about what should be valued and what shouldn't. And we'll get into this, but some of those values are rank and status in the street and in the community. So that can be paramount to anything else in some situations, and that's a collective thing. There aren't individuals who are focusing on that more than other people. That's kind of a theme in this grouping of people, the subculture. Again, violence is an acceptable response to individual issues that people encounter. All right, let's get this guy working. There we go. The first part, we're going to focus on this kind of Chicago school idea, social disorganization. There's a couple different theorists that fell into this category, but in around the 30s or so, 1930s or so, some theorists focused on Chicago as the city they were in. The University of Chicago is mainly where they came from, but they saw that Chicago was getting bigger, like many other cities were, many other large cities, and they were growing in a predictable way, kind of growing outward, and they saw not to be hyperbolic, but they saw kind of the city as a living, breathing thing, so to speak. They had a lot of different elements and components of it, and it was broken up a lot into different zones and different neighborhoods and different areas, but all of these things worked together, and it kind of formed its own, it formed an entity of its own. And there was a criminal aspect to that as well. And so they wanted to see how they could explain that criminal element based on all these other aspects of the city working together, and that included geographic zones and ecological principles, things working off of each other. So Shaw and McKay are the two prominent names we're going to talk about. What they did with their research is they actually looked at found addresses of juveniles who were in the court system, who had cases, who had arrests and whatnot, and so they tracked those addresses that were on record for those cases of those juveniles, of those individuals. And if there were no interaction between areas of the city, geography, and crime and delinquency, then there should be randomly distributed addresses in the group of addresses they found throughout the city, north side, south side, west side, everywhere throughout the city, including near suburbs as well. At the time in the 30s, it was different in terms of the lines and the boundaries, but they didn't find that. They found that they were not randomly distributed, that they were grouped, and that they were in certain areas and they weren't in other certain areas. So they were clustered, and the highest was near the central business district. So in Chicago, the central business district is the Loop, and some of the criticism of this theory is that we'll get into the zones in a second, but some of these things have changed over time, the makeup of the city. It's getting close to 100 years, less than that, but getting close to 100 years that Shaw and McKay originally did their work. So there seemed to be a difference when you go out from the central business districts in terms of the frequency of crime. And what they called Zone 2, the transition zone just out of the central business district, was where you found most crime before you got into the residential areas. And a problem that people might think of is that we now have kind of this blurring of residential area and central business district, in that we have the West Loop and then the Loop itself having plenty of residential area, and then plenty of neighborhoods within, give or take, within the central business district that are residential as well, not just a few zones outward from the central business district. So how does that affect the theory, and does it hold up as well? Some of the key elements they found and the variables that they felt were able to explain why those certain areas, again, Zone 2, and I'll show you the zones in 1 second here, but poverty, heterogeneity, and physical dilapidation. So if people are impoverished, low socioeconomic status, if they're from a variety of ethnic and racial groups, and if there's physical dilapidation. So actual buildings are kind of falling apart, things are not being kept up, roads are not being kept up, signs are not being kept up, whatever. Then some of these elements, these various social ills, if you will, tend to overlap with this higher delinquency rate. And there's a couple different ideas of why that might be. We'll get into a few of them, and then some other ones are within your other text, the video I'm having you watch. There tended to be an overlap with things like education issues, things like low birth rate, low infant mortality rates. There tended to be an overlap with those issues and delinquency rates. So we saw this phenomenon that crime is not this isolated issue within cities. It is just one of many issues within cities that tend to overlap with these other issues. So there's a relationship between those two. and there's a relationship between crime and delinquency and these many other issues that are broken up geographically. Sean McKay's research too is longitudinal, meaning it takes place over time, and an interesting finding was that they basically controlled for race and ethnicity by looking at the different zones over time, because different racial and ethnic groups would change as the composition of the city kind of changes. So they wanted to make sure to follow those different groups to differentiate between a group having a higher delinquency rate or the area. And the area tended to be, with an exception of Asian Americans being in that area itself, the zone 2, still had higher delinquency rates over time. So there wasn't a change in delinquency rates based on ethnic and racial groups, because when following those ethnic and racial groups, then we didn't see that continued high level of delinquency. It remained within that original zone. And I'll show people this real quick. This is Burgess's idea of these concentric zones, meaning they have that one center, which is the loop in this case, the Central Business District, Zone 1. Zone 2, the zone in transition, is where we see the most delinquency. That's where we have people that are not in the business area, the central business area, but they're kind of transient and they're not outward to the established homes area, whether it's a residential zone or a commuter zone, which is kind of the suburbs and whatnot, so Chicagoland area. But as you can see, this is a dated chart, or map rather. You can see some of these areas are not necessarily the same, and they're not as relevant now because they're a little bit different. But one of the issues is that, say, Zone 4 is residential zone. That is now partially the central business zone has residential areas as well. Another concept that goes along with this idea of dilapidation and the issue of dilapidated areas having higher delinquency rates is this broken windows theory. People may have heard of broken windows theory. It actually came about later on, so much later than Shaw and McKay, but it came about later on with the concepts that we talked about 2 weeks ago, the resurgence of classical school. But the idea is that disorder is caused by disreputable people, meaning that disorder within a community is because people are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're up to no good, whatnot, and that disorder causes a breakdown in informal controls. We talked about informal costs a little while ago, a couple weeks ago, in terms of cost-benefit analysis, and so informal control is going to be that neighborhood control as opposed to formal control, which would be the criminal justice system and educational system and whatnot. But the informal control is the cohesiveness of the neighborhood. If people in the neighborhood are watching out for you, if people in the neighborhood are concerned with you, if you are concerned with what people in the neighborhood will think, those are all informal controls. And when there are people who are not, who are up to no good and causing disorder in areas, then some of which would present as broken windows, then there'll be this breakdown of informal control, and people will not be as basically protective of their neighborhood. So if that's the case and people aren't as protective or invested in their neighborhood, then the idea is there will be an invasion of other predators from other criminals, predatory criminals from outside areas that are going to commit all sorts of crimes, and then thus it leads us to that being a high crime rate in those areas. So the idea is that the disorder causes high crime rates in neighborhoods. So starting from the broken windows, it doesn't have to just be a broken window. That's just kind of the symbol of disorder and dilapidation, having a number of buildings with broken windows that are not repaired. Having windows that are broken and not repaired shows that there's not really collective efficacy. The neighborhood is not really concerned with itself, so to speak. So this is a somewhat controversial theory, sub-theory kind of. For a lot of people, it's a little reductive. It's a little too simplistic that we're just saying, not keeping up the physical environment of a certain neighborhood is going to lead to crime. There are a lot of other issues and factors that are related to that, but as some theories like this go, this has a good application has a good policy implications. Whenever you have kind of this process in place to determine why crime exists, similar to routine activities theory, then if you disrupt one of those elements, one of the legs of the chair, one of the steps of the process, then that should essentially prevent crime from happening. So the idea is if you fix the broken windows element of it, or whatever else is dilapidated, maybe the easiest area to approach in the situation. So the idea is that you fix those broken windows and you fix crime. So again, that seems a little simplistic for a lot of people. The other element we're going to talk about, subcultural theories. So not just this works hand in hand with social disorganization and other elements of the Chicago School in looking at neighborhoods of the city and communities within the city and their interaction and their ability to produce crime and have crime be a social product of them. But this looks at the social grouping of individuals within households and other groups within certain neighborhoods and communities. So subcultural assumes that there are unique groups of society that socialize their children to believe that certain activities that violate conventional law are good and positive ways to behave. We continue to go away from the individual element. So if we have people who are individually committing crime, then it's not necessarily all as a result of the choices they make. They may be the result of an upbringing that leads them to believe that it's okay to violate conventional law and that sometimes doing so is actually a positive thing. So our values or codes are different in these subcultures than potentially the rest of society or what we believe the rest of society thinks. Violence is often thought of as completely acceptable in this situation, acceptable way to achieve your goals and an acceptable way to respond to negativity. And that is a culturally learned way of dealing with life, of violence. So this is maybe a little different from some other theories we have, control theories, which we'll talk about, and some other theories that focus on the natural desire of individuals to have what they want. Some might say that in some regards is talking about violence being a natural thing. And so here we're talking about the opposite. Violence is a culturally learned way of dealing with life. It's not something that's natural to people. Ferracuti and Wolfgang looked at violence with young kids, with young boys in Philadelphia, looked at violent themes and different groups of kids based on the location they lived in, but also kind of their socioeconomic status, to see if there were subcultures. They understood that, like I just mentioned, that violence was culturally learned. It was learned within those groups, and it was also learned within households of each of those individuals and then passed on within those groups. It kind of became this subcultural norm, this emphasis on violence as a way to handle situations. So as a way to handle your general constant life situation, like negative life situations, or as a way to handle situations that just come up, or handle circumstances of your life or situations that might present themselves. So it's an interesting discussion that you could have then, that those people that we consider to be deviant, are they really deviating from any norms if they have these subcultural norms that violence is okay, that are made, and those norms themselves are maybe different from societal norms, so we would consider them to be deviating from societal norms by committing violence. But if their subcultural norm is to commit violence, then they're not really deviating. So for them, they're not really being deviant. They're just doing what they have learned to do, and they're doing what everybody else in their community is doing. So it's kind of an interesting debate to have there, to say, are these people really being deviant then? Maybe this group and this subculture is deviant from the rest of society's norms, but the individuals themselves are not necessarily being deviant because they're not deviating from the norms of their subculture. And there's a different value system, different code system that is in place in these different subcultures. Miller is the theorist here who talks about this lower class, lower socioeconomic status cultural value system. There were a few different foci, a few different focal concerns that were found in these groups of people. There's this kind of overarching concept that there's not a lot of control that people have for their own situation in life, that these are just the cards they've been dealt, so you kind of have to just go with it. So there's that approach, and that can influence how people deal with things, right? If they feel that they don't really have the control over, whether they're going to get out of that life or not, and they just have to deal with the cards they've been dealt, that's going to change how they interact and how they behave. Autonomy, a life free of authority, that can be the criminal justice system, and this idea that they kind of live in this subculture where they're not affected or controlled as much by authority. But that also includes education as well, especially obviously people who would be in school at the time, teenagers and whatnot. The idea of trouble, legal or otherwise, just kind of getting in trouble again in school and other places, it can be seen as a positive thing. It can be seen as conferring status and rank to individuals. This idea that getting in trouble, whether it's getting kicked out of school, whether it's getting in a fight, whether it's getting arrested, getting incarcerated, that can actually confer some status to those individuals. This idea that they'll get a little bit more street cred, so to speak, and a little bit more rank in the eyes of a lot of other people. Toughness, that can go hand in hand with trouble too, how somebody responds to trouble. So physically and emotionally too, there's not much acceptance at all of emotional instability and inability to be tough emotionally. So, but this obviously produces violence as well, being physically tough. It's very important to males in this situation. Excitement, risk-taking, breaking rules, that's all very consistent in these subcultures as well. And there's also this focus on kind of this street smartness, which goes along a little bit with this idea of autonomy and being kind of separate from the rest of society, being separate from having this separate subculture, is that getting things done the way you have to get things done, outsmarting people, out-conning people. There's some nobility and some notoriety that comes along with that, and some status and rank. So these subcultures have this code by which they live their lives, and the code has to do with their family and different families as well, but it also has to do with their communities. It's kind of the set of informal rules that kind of governs public behavior mainly. So there is a lot that this code enforces within households, but it focuses a lot on the public interaction, so especially within the streets or on the streets and whatnot. So It involves violence, interaction with individuals, interpersonal interactions that quite often involve violence. Respect is a large part of this code too, and the different ways through which people obtain respect and maintain respect. A lot of it has to do with those things we just went over. This idea of the code of the streets, subcultural violence, is by Elijah Anderson. He wrote it in the 90s about Philadelphia, I believe. Philadelphia, I believe. And so the heart of that code is respect, and violence is a part of that code too. And he believes that there are two different types of groups. Calls them decent family and street families, and you can kind of assume something from these names. But the decent families he considers to kind of accept the mainstream values. There's still this subculture in this code of the street, but they don't necessarily adhere to all of these subcultural beliefs. They actually adhere to more of the mainstream values, and they attempt to instill them in children despite some inequities and lack of resources they might have in their environment. Usually they're working poor, they're maybe not, they're employed, they're working, they're trying to use the institutional means to achieve their goals. Church communities, they tend to be strict with children as well, and there's a respect to authority, and so much different from the idea of the street families that they have. And these aren't necessarily, these aren't homeless people. They're people that are living their lives more by the code of the street than decent families. There's a lack of consideration for other people in their neighborhood, so there's that lack of collective efficacy, meaning that there's cohesion in the community and the neighborhood, and people are working together, so there's a lack of consideration for what others are doing, for what others think of what they are doing. There's just kind of a lack of involvement with the rest of the community. So not a strong sense of family or community, very superficial sense, disorganized, aggressive with children, so physical punishment, violence, call it discipline if you want, put whatever type of qualifier you want on there, but if children are exposed to violence early on and are taught that violence is an okay way to deal with things, in this case with discipline, then they're going to internalize that and think that violence is an okay way to deal with other things, including any uncomfortable interaction they might have with somebody, any disrespect they might feel from somebody else. It's okay to use violence. That's something that street families value by the code of the street, that you can use violence when respect has been affected by somebody else. And so the idea is that they want their kids to learn that and take that with them as they become adults. If we're looking at these theories and looking at the kind of the smaller social approach, where we look at communities and neighborhoods, there are a lot of things that we can do to address that. A little different than the kind of macro societal focus of institutions and societal inequalities and whatnot. But there are a lot of things within the community to kind of build that cohesion, because there were a lot of different elements of these sub-theories and other theories that we talked about that had to do with informal controls, had to do with collective efficacy, cohesion within the neighborhood and the community. So working on that, doing things to work on those ideas is going to be helpful for preventing delinquency, because of some of those breakdowns that we have. When we have informal controls break down and people don't have those present, people don't think about those, people don't consider other people in their neighborhood, so that's when we get that breakdown a lot that leads to delinquency. So improving, adding community organizations, getting more community organizations involved with those many different elements of neighborhoods too: education, religion, employment, parks, everything else that's kind of working together to kind of build that cohesion with the neighborhood and the community. And so in terms of how this applies to, this is a good theory. These are good theories to explain certain types of criminal activity, right? In certain areas, certain groups. It kind of has some issues when we go out into suburban areas, into rural areas. Also, we face some issues when we have some changes in the composition of those cities, like we saw with the loop starting to include some residential areas. What do we do now when those zones kind of blur? It also, with social disorganization theory, there is some tautological issues, meaning there's kind of this circular logic. We're saying that crime is a result of social disorganization and a neighborhood and community being disorganized, but we're also saying that one of the criteria that should be met to consider social disorganization is crime. So we're using social disorganization to explain crime, but then also saying one of the criteria of social disorganization is crime. So we can get into the circular logic, which we consider tautological. So there could be some issues with that. Again, this is the first point we start to focus mainly on crime as a social product. Focus on the sociological and social element of crime, which makes sense because criminology came out of sociology. So we're getting back into that focus, and we're in that for a long time. We're in that for the 20th century, and arguably we're still in it, even if we had a little bit of resurgence in the 90s and whatnot, and the early 21st century of classical school routine activities theory and rational choice. We still primarily focus on this social element because we understand that we appreciate the social influence of individuals on other things, but as we see sometimes we still have an issue implementing that with criminal behavior, because we still want to look at criminal behavior as an individual choice that's being made, but crime is as much a social product as many other behaviors are in many other facets of life. So next week we're going to talk about strain theories, which are more social theories, socially focused theories, where we'll look at some inequalities and then also general strain theory. So everybody take care. I'll see you next week. I hope you enjoyed the video, and take care. So try to let this go to reach 40 minutes. What? I'm just kidding. There's nobody there. It's a nice office. Construction was 1914. One of the first in this area.